the esteemed speaker for today's session, Dr. Achitesh Panda, Dr. Anandita Roy Saha, Coordinator, Center for Earth Studies, all the faculty members and participants in this lecture session in the online certificate course on climate, community, and conservation. And today's session will be under the theme Climate and Community. So on behalf of the Department of Environmental Studies and the IP College community, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to Dr. Panda for agreeing to deliver a talk in this session. It is my privilege to introduce him to the speakers, to all the participants joined here. So Dr. Architesh, he works at the MCII Munich Climate Incidence Initiative in United Nations University, Bonn, and contributes to the research and policy advisory. Architesh provides technical advisory and support for the V20 group on issues pertaining to climate and disaster risk, financing, and contributes to the further development and implementation of V20-led Sustainable Incidence Facility with a focus on V20 members from Asia Pacific. He holds a PhD in environmental economics. Prior to taking up his position at MCII, he worked with the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Earlier, he has worked with International Rice Research Institute in South and Southeast Asia countries, where he focused on climate and disaster risk insurance, building adaptation and resilience to climate change at the micro level and addressing policy challenges of climate-induced migration. So, Dr. Panda, I'm sure that all the participants are going to immensely benefit from your years of working with research and in an advisory role in the field. I once again welcome you to deliver a talk in this session. So the session is with you now, sir. Please.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot for the introduction, and I'm really pleased to be here today. And thanks for inviting as well. And I hope this session will be interesting. And as we all know, that this is quite a very broad area when we talk on climate change and migration. So I will try to reflect and throw lights on some of the most important aspects, because in one lecture it's very hard to cover all the aspects of climate change and migration. And I'm not sure what are the modalities of the lecture, but yeah, feel free to ask any questions at any point. But before that, may I ask about the timing a little bit, Dr. Tiwari here?
So you have around 1 hour for your session, and then we can have Q&A. So the timing is flexible; it's entirely up to you. We can even extend to 4:30 if you want to go a bit longer. If we have more interesting question answer sessions, so we can extend to 4:30. But usually 1 hour of a session, and then we have Q&As.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Just wanted to keep in mind the timing. Yeah, thanks. So can you all see my screen here?
Yes, sir, your screen is visible.
Yes,
okay, thanks. So I'll start my presentation here, and thanks again for inviting. And the topic of today's presentation will be climate change and human mobility in the 21st century. I was asked to talk on climate migration, but I thought to put human mobility in this context, and we'll come to that later. But that's the topic of today's discussion, and I'm going to highlight a few of the very important facts emerging on the emerging theme of climate change and migration. You can see in the first slide that you have few pictures here, like people going out of their places with livestock. Some people are moving out of flood. Some people are moving out of drought. So this picture basically reflects that climate change has various impacts on how people move around the world. So this will be my structure of the presentation. I will throw some light on the introduction and some background on climate change. How do we perceive climate change? What are the climate change impacts we have? Then I will come to the climate change and the migration nexus, which I feel is quite complicated. That's why I gave the name of complicated nexus. We will try to learn some lessons from the evidence around the world, what's happening around the world, and is there any cases that we can learn from. Then I will come into the particular case of slow onset events, which I think globally is currently one of the most important themes in terms of climate migration. That's just because we all know that when there is sudden onset disasters like floods and let's say cyclones, people are forced to move out of their houses all of a sudden. So we all know that we have at some point of time we have also experienced that when there is a cyclone, people are being evacuated all of a sudden in 24 hours. So that's kind of rapid onset disasters. But we are very less, we are less concerned about the slow onset events, like let's say about sea level rise and desertification. So I thought to focus on that aspect a little bit. Then I will try to focus some of the key aspects in India, and then I'll conclude. So yeah, we all know that migration has been there as a topic, especially for the economic students. I myself is an economist, so I know that I have read theories in undergrads and postgrads about how there is a big theory of climate economics of migration, and we know that there are push and pull factors. And we also know that economic regions has been the dominant cause of climate migration around the world, because we know that people migrate from rural areas to urban areas in search of livelihood, in search of more income. So we have this perception that also the reality that economic factors has been and dominant factor or determinant of climate change migration. But let's come back to a little bit of history here. That you can see from the slide here, I have written that 6 centuries ago, before Adam Smith, there was a scholar called Arab scholar Ibn Khaldun, who proposed a theory of cyclical development, whereby the parallel movements of population, urbanization, and public finance determine the rise and fall of civilizations. So it's not something new that I am talking about. Migration has been there since many centuries, and it has been a key factor in terms of the thinking of economic development, how we develop over the last few centuries. And we also know that without the movement of goods and people and ideas, economy will stagnate, because if people don't migrate, nothing will shift from one place to other place. Let's say, may it be labor, may it be capital, may it be production. So we are the carriers of those factors of productions, and it has been an essential component to keep the economy moving. So it's not really a bad thing. Migration has been there, and it has been a big factor of our rise and fall of civilizations. And we also know that from the earlier days, people have migrated to the place where there is a river. All the civilizations have flourished near a river, near the natural resources. You can see from the picture, in the case of India, the most densely populated population, they are really staying near the water bodies of India. So that's just to reflect the fact that natural resources has been an important component in terms of attracting people, building civilizations, and keeping the livelihoods alive. So it has been there from history. Now, coming to climate change. Well, climate change is a very big issue, and I am sure that the listeners here, the students here, or the research scholars, they are aware about the fact that climate change has been an important topic of discussion. And in the recent IPCC report, 60th assessment report, they have provided a red code for humanity, which means we are almost on the verge of crossing all the limits of climate change, especially 1.5 degrees before the pre-industrial level. And yeah, in that context, climate migration has been an important topic, and people are discussing that, okay, how many people are going to be displaced because of climate change, maybe because of floods, maybe because of droughts, and maybe because of cyclones, maybe because of sea level rise, desertification. We all know that. But the thing is, here we have been an established theory, at least in terms of economic literature, that what are the major regions of migration. So if you look at the right-hand side diagram here, it's a study from World Bank, where they analyzed data from 189 countries, explaining that what are the most important determinants of migration. Why do people migrate? So you can see from the picture here that household size and age has been the dominant factor to push people to migrate. So that's the dominant factor around the world. When you taken all the factors from rainfall shock to marital status to gender to education, household size and age came out to be dominant factors in terms of reason why people migrate, or at least in terms of determination. But if you look at the left-hand side corner of the figure, you can see that rainfall shock also is one of the most important determinant, coming out as an important factor for pushing people to migrate. Which I want to show is that not climate change, but climatic factors are also as important as other factors nowadays in terms of pushing people to migrate. And we also know that climate change has been an issue, and there is also an Sustainable Development Goal Target 10.7, which calls for signatories to facilitate orderly, safe, and responsible migration of people, including through implementation of planned and well-managed policies. I will come to that later. So you have also must have seen that in the media there are like news hungry people telling that climate refugees, like there is a massive wave of climate refugees coming out and people are going to displaced in billions and millions and things like this. So this term climate refugees has really pushed the agenda of climate migration to the fore, not just because of sensational journalism, but also because to emphasize the fact that climate migration is really a big threat for our civilization. Now, as I talked about climate change, let's see what's happening in the sphere of climate change. This is just a graph I'm trying to show here that mm, from 169 studies, where they have tried to see what are the likely disasters that are going to be increasing in the future or becoming more severe, and uh, and there is a clear link to human impact that we call anthropogenic impact of climate change. If you are familiar about the word anthropogenic, which means the influence of humans on changing the climate. And what they have found from this 189 studies is that heat, drought, and flooding are really going to be the three big disasters in the next century. And there is conclusive evidence that these events are going to be more serious. So this is to reflect the fact that these three factors will also interact with the migration in a different way in the coming times. Now we all know that there are different kinds of disasters. When we talk about migration and climate change, we not only talk about changes in temperature, we not only talk about the changes in rainfall patterns, we also talk about the extreme events which has become a reality in the recent years, and scientists have really toiled hard to find the concrete link between climate change and extreme disaster events, and as reinforced in the sixth assessment report that really climate change is going to have an impact on extreme disasters and we are all going to suffer from them. So in terms of floods, there is enough evidence to show that flood frequency is going to increase, especially in Asia and all over the world. And you can see how many people, like 35 million people per year, being affected due to floods in India and Bangladesh. And on the right hand side, you can see, just to show you the severity of the thing, the map shows from recent paper that higher flood exposure and high climate flood induced displacement. So you can see India has the big red flag that with increasing floods, there are more likely chances that people are going to migrate because of the floods. That's one aspect. Now coming to cyclone, we all know that cyclone has been a factor for rapid evacuation of people from the coast. We all know about the cyclones in Odisha. We know about super cyclones in 1999. We have been experiencing cyclones every year, and we know that people are being evacuated all of a sudden from the place, and they are being forced to displace from their home. But in addition to the forced displacement, there are also cases because of tropical cyclones and sea level rise. People have been shifted from islands, because when we talk about tropical cyclones, we really tend to focus on the small islands in the Pacific and the Bay of Bengal, where there are very small islands in the Pacific where the population is very small. And because of this tropical cyclones and increasing flood level, increasing tide, there are cases that people are migrating or they are being shifted from one place to other place. In this case, you can see in the right hand side the case of Carteret Island, where the migration or relocation has been taking place since 2007 from Papua New Guinea. And because of the climate change impact, they are already shifting from Papua New Guinea to different island in the Carteret Island, and they are being relocated. So this is another one more example how climate change can impact migration. Now coming to sea level rise, we all know that it's not a rapid onset disaster; it's a slow onset disaster, and it's not really clearly visible to us. You can really see the sea level rise. It rises very slowly, and scientific predictions tell us that sea level rise is going to be rapid in the coming decade. And we also heard in the news last week that we are already crossing the tipping points of the Earth, where you can see the ice melting of Antarctica and permafrost melting down, and we're facing the tipping point. So here also, sea level rise also plays an important role in climate migration. On the right hand side, you can see a picture I have just tried to show few states in India who are being impacted by sea level rise. One example is in the Sundarbans. I am sure many people have read the news on Sundarbans that there was an island called Lohachara, which was where the people has been displaced around 1970s, and they were shifted to a nearby island called Sagar Island because that island is already vanished from the map of the earth. So that now they are being shifted to Sagar Island, and Sagar Island now is also again sinking, which means once you shift the people from one place to other place from a threat of risk, now the new place is again in the threat of risk of climate change. So they will have to displace again. Again, coming to the case of Odisha, there is an example. I will come to that later. It's called Satavaya in Odisha, where people, 700 around 700 families have been relocated from the place because of sea level rise and constant flooding. So these four examples I gave just to tell you that there is a clear link between all the aspects of impacts of climate change, especially droughts, sea level rise, tropical cyclones, and floods, which might have an impact on people migrating. Coming to droughts and water stress, it's a very slow moving disasters. We have a lot of examples from Africa where we have seen that people have been migrating because of desertification and droughts. They're leaving their home, going to the cities, and people are migrating. And with the recent impact of climate change, with projections, we know that these things are going to be intensified in the coming decade, which basically, in summary, means that with increasing level of climate change, we are going to experience more impacts on how we move around the world. That's human mobility, how we're moving from the one place to other place. Now, this is the first part I wanted to tell you, throw some light on how climate change is linked to human migration or human mobility, either for good or for bad. Like, for example, people are moving from one area because of flood to the cities. Maybe it's good adaptation for them. They are going to adapt and they're going to leave the place out of their own will. So this kind of a complicated link. I will come to that in the next slides. Now, coming to this, everyone might be thinking that, oh, no, climate migration, climate refugees is a recent issue of the last 2-3 decades or something like that. People are terrified to look at the news and flood of migration. But if you look at the history of migration, I have just given a few indicators from literature that how historically migration has been a recurrent phenomena. If you can look at the from migration from Mesopotamia and Europe, if you look at migration from southern Mesopotamia, if you look at the fall of Akkadian Empire, if you look at the migration waves in Central Europe, if you look the decline of Maya civilization, if you look the decline of Anasazi civilization, if you look at the Great Irish Famine most recently, or if you look at the two examples I have given on the left-hand side, that in 1975 the earthquake of Lisbon destroyed most of the city, inducing a mass displacement towards other parts of Portugal. And later they came back to Lisbon. But that's the kind of example we have in history, that migration due to natural regions is something not new. You can see from the figure that the red squares are droughts. The climate and disease are one more. There is earthquake displacement. Also, there is one more example from US, which is known as the Dust Bowl years, where because of desertification, people migrated out of the lands towards the cities in the 1930s, which is known as the Dust Bowl years. So here I want to emphasize the fact that climate migration because of environmental regions is something not new. There are long historical studies on that. There has been many cases throughout our history where people have migrated because of different regions of climate, may it be drought, may it be glaciation, may it be climate and diseases. But that was history. What differentiates the climate migration we are talking now from these historical factors? We need to look at those things. Coming to this, let's see this how this whole debate of climate refugee actually started, because it's just a very new thing. It's not really old. I think it's maybe 4 decades or so. And you can see from here on the right hand side, I have just tried to give the studies that really push the climate refugee or climate migration agenda to the picture, starting from the paper on Mayors and Kent in 1995 and into the papers of Jacobson in 1988, which was probably the first paper in 50 or 60 years, which predicted that there will be 10 million migration because of the climate change. So that's the first attempt to personalize the definition of environmental refugee. So it's not really very old that talking about climate refugees. It's like 1998, which is like barely 3 decades or 4 decades old. But what I try to emphasize here is that if you look at the right-hand side of the graph, you see that After Mayors and Kent paper 1995, when they predicted that 150 million people will be displaced by 2050, then 200 million people by 2025, then again 200 million to 300 million by Christian Aid, then the Nicholas Stern paper where they predicted 150 to 200 million by 2050, then Global Humanitarian Forum predicted 78 million people. So you can see this amplifying picture of how many people are going to be displaced. But there is a click here. All the studies starting from Mayors and Kent from 1995 was kind of more of a rough prediction. It was based on a weak methodology. Even coming to the report of Nicholas Stern, that was not really based on robust methodology to predict about climate migration. What it was based on was a kind of people at risk of migrating from their places because of environmental reasons. So I want to draw here to the fact that in the initial years of the debate of climate migration, it was more kind of a sensation than kind of a based on facts and figures and proper methodology, which is till now we are still developing on the methodological aspect of how to really improve on predicting the people of migration. On the left hand side, you can see a recent figure from I think, if I'm not wrong, it's a figure from Action Aid that was published in the last year, and they try to show you through modeling exercise, climate modeling, how many people are going to be displaced, and you can see the numbers are really very less from what has been on the right hand side, or at least not really comparable, because on the right hand side the figures are based on some kind of vague indicators, not really properly based, but on the left hand side it is based on climate modeling, predicting how many people are going to be displaced from Southeast Asia, especially Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Pakistan. So I want you to keep in mind that this is like it's a kind of very sensitive topic. So when you think about this, how many people are going to migrate, you really need to check on what kind of methodology has been used in the paper, or it's just a statement that okay, 3 billion people are going to be migrate because of climate change. No, it's not. So the focus here is to distinguish between the good kind of analysis of migration and the bad kind of analysis of migration. Although I am not saying that the right hand side figure is totally relevant, it's surely relevant because it's based on scientific finding, but still then they have weak methodology. So this is about communicating the climate change and migration. Now let's come to the first part, what I was telling about that it's a very complicated nexus on climate change and migration. That's because there are a lot of things. So this slide will show you how the topic has been dealt with from different angle. We talk about migration, we talk about displacement, we talk about evacuation, we talk about plant relocation, we talk about human mobility, which is basically like all kind of voluntary migration to forced migration. We talk about environmental migration. We talk about trapped population where people can migrate, but some of the people cannot migrate because they're left behind. So the taxonomy is quite different here in the context of climate change and migration, which really influence the political undertones. So the thing here is that like we really need to be careful when we're talking about migration, whether it is displacement, whether it is evacuation, whether it is plant relocation, or whether it is just human mobility. So you can't really mix everything in one place. So the first part of the whole debate, this taxonomy and how we really define those different kinds of categories of migrants. Now coming to the second part, this is something important we need to look at, that there are basically 5 or 6 kind of things which is always being attached to the whole debate of climate change and migration. On the left hand side, you can see, as I discussed earlier, data and prognosis. We are still developing on the methodological aspect of climate change and migration. We are still improving on the climate models, how to predict the migration, because it's very complicated nexus. Then we have things like internal versus international migration. We know that people migrate both internally and also internationally from one country to another. Although most of the migration, because of environmental factors, has been inside the country or internal migration. Then we also talk about temporary versus permanent migration, where people migrate to earn some money for 6 months in a year, then they come back. There is a drought in the village, they go out of the village, they earn for 6 months, then they come back. There are also cases of permanent migration where people permanently migrate. There are very few examples in the context of climate change. I will come to that, especially in the case of plant relocation, when when the place is not really habitable anymore and they are forced to leave the place, which I told in the case of Odisha in Satapaya, which I told in the case of West Bengal in the Sundarbans. So that's temporary versus permanent migration. Then we have forced versus voluntary migration. We have also vulnerability and resilience there. And we also have some kind of conflict linkages. The last part, conflict linkages, is sorry. It's mainly based on cases from sub-Saharan Africa, there is this complex nexus of climate, conflict, and migration, where people are migrating both because of environmental factors and because of conflict factors. But considering this, we have a lot of uncertainties when we talk about migration and climate change. The first one, let's say, nature of the climate change. I'm not sure if you have heard about the tipping points. Johan Rockström, who is a pioneer on this tipping point theory, and the Anthropocene. There are seven kinds of tipping points of the Earth, like the level of methane oxygen, and then ice melt in the Antarctica. So there are 7 kinds of tipping points where they argue that once we cross the tipping points, we will have devastating consequences to the world in terms of disasters and their impact. So that's the first kind of uncertainty we have when we talk about migration. How does that play a role in when we talk about migration? Like if we cross the tipping point, what will happen? Then the second uncertainty is future extent of environmental change. Of course, we know we have a lot of climate models with different scenarios that predicts that, okay, in the next 25 years, we're going to cross the 1.5 degrees and we're reaching the 2 degrees Celsius as compared to the pre-industrial level. But the extent of environmental change is still uncertain. We're not really sure. That creates one more layer of problem when we talk about climate change and migration. The third one is future levels of adaptation. We all know that. I am sure some of you have heard about adaptation, where we try to adapt to the changing climate. So we don't know what will be the future level of adaptation, which will determine the kind of migration will people have. Then the last one will be last two is like complex nature of human vulnerable to climate change, which is also uncertain. Then also we have this individualized responses to climate change in terms of migration. I want to migrate, but someone else don't want to. He wants to stay the place. He has attachment to his own place, so he doesn't want to migrate. So these things also come into play, which makes the whole debate of climate migration a little bit more complicated. So this is the second layer when we talk about climate change and migration. The third one is methods. I just discussed before that we have different kinds of methods, but if you look at the current literature, mainly we have 3 kinds of methods we are following now. One is the qualitative or ethnographic methods, where you go to the field and stay for, you collect qualitative answers from the people and try to understand the whole nexus of what's happening to migrate. Do you want to migrate? What are the reasons for migration? Kind of this. Then we have modeling techniques at the head of climate scientists. They are taking, for example, let's say how many people are living in just above 5 meters of sea level, so that the population at risk who are going to migrate. So they're using modeling technique. And then the third one is the scenario planning, where you kind of put some scenarios like high growth economic scenario, low growth economic scenario, and you try to see what will happen to the migration in the future. So these are the key aspects when we talk about climate change and migration, and in terms of the aspects, uncertainties and methods. Then the third aspect is theories. So until now, it was like, I think it's not really very late. It was in 2011 when there was a study called Foresight Studies from United Nations University, which was the kind of a first study to do a systematic understanding of environmental change and what are the drivers of migration. You can see the picture on the right hand side, where they tried to untangle the factors that really affect the decision to migration of people. On the left hand side, you can see there are few like theories which has been going there around for some time, as I just discussed that. In the early 20th centuries, environmental drivers feature quite prominently in the geography literature. But then, when we in the 1980s and 2011, which we just discussed, that there was this whole debate of really amplifying that climate change will lead to millions of people migrating. And that's known as the debate of maximalist versus the minimalist, where the maximalists try to say that, okay, like even if there is a small flood, millions of people are going to migrate. So they are trying to put all weight on the environmental factor as a reason for migration, which is known as the debate of maximalist versus minimalist. Then, which also led to the politics of environmental migration in the last 2 decades, where this whole concept of flood of climate refugees gained traction in the global media, and also it's continuing to the present time, which is really influencing the whole debate of politics of migration, where let's say the North countries are telling, okay, if climate change is going to impact the all the islands of the world, and all the islands are going to be drowned, where they will go. So if there is a flood of refugees, who are going to keep them? In which country they are going to keep them? So that's the whole debate of environmental migration at the global level on refugees. And the third one is related to the securitization debate, where they try to link the two sides basically through resource scarcity, which might lead to the migration. Where the study by Homer Dixon was really the cornerstone of this kind of debate, where the three factors of population growth, resource degradation, and conflict might lead to migration. So this is not the all the existing theories in terms of migration. I'm just focusing on a few here because there are also theories in economics, neoclassical theory, and other theories, push and pull theory, and many other theories are there in the economics. But in this part, I'm just trying to focus that there has been some types of conceptualization in the early 2000s, especially starting from 2011. If you see the right hand side study, which is known as the foresight study in 2011, they try to conceptualize from 2011 onwards what really happening in the whole sphere of migration, and can we really theorize it. And that's where this whole debate of climate refugees moved from a rhetoric or sensationalism to some kind of theoretical development, which started from this paper in 2011, where they try to really link different aspects, let's say political, environmental, demographic, economic, social, and how it's impacting the decision to migrate of people, and what role does environmental factors play in the whole scenario, and which is based on empirical data from the ground. So this is the second phase of the whole debate, where we try to theorize the whole concept of climate change and migration. Yeah. So what was the lesson learned from this studies during the 2011 to 2016 or 17 in the last in 2 decades before? So what was the most important finding at that time was that multi-causality. You can't really establish a direct causal relationship between climate change and migration, or environment and migration. That's why I told in the beginning it's a complicated nexus. It's nearly impossible to say that you migrated because of environmental reasons, unless you have specific cases like an island going down the sea because of sea level rise. In that case, okay, these people have to migrate because of environment, not even climate change, unless you don't establish that the island went down the sea because of climate change, which is very hard to establish. So the main finding from these studies in the initial studies were that there are a lot of factors here. You can see from the graph. You have economic factors, you have demographic factors, you have political factors, you have environmental factors, which really push people to migrate, or at least push people to take a decision on whether they want to migrate or not. So the whole point of showing the slide is that there a whole relation between climate change or environment or migration is it's multi-causal. So it's really not really a great idea to have a concept that climate change is the only driver of migration. It can't be never unless there are specific cases. So it's always different kind of factors that those are involved uh, along with the environmental regions that people decide to migrate. Maybe it is the case that environmental factors or climatic factors are one of the most important reasons in that context, which we can find through data analysis. Let's say some regression analysis, and say that okay, we found that environmental regions are the most important determinant of people to migrate. You can say that, but it's nearly impossible to establish a direct link between climate change and migration. It's always a case of multi-causality, and you have to, in that whole multi-causality, you have to see what kind of factors are playing a role in that. So this is the whole idea of showing the slide. Now coming to the third one, after that we now coming to the climate change. We all know that economic factors are there, different factors are there. But along with climate change, the debate of climate change and migration, we can see here from the graph that I have three kinds of things here: drivers, triggers, and impacts. The drivers will be sea level rise. We already discussed about that. Desertification, glacial melt, increasing temperature, land and forest degradation, loss of biodiversity, ocean acidification, salinization, which will lead to loss of livelihood of people, food and water scarcity of people, sudden onset hazards for the people, and loss of territory, which means you lose some lands to some kind of disasters, which has ultimately impact the livelihoods of people, the education of people, the security of people, health, housing conditions, social life, and environment. So this is the kind of theoretical link between climate change and migration. This is what we talk about in the context of climate change, um, keeping out the economic theories out of the purview. And we have different action point here. Like we can talk about climate change mitigation to reduce the impacts on the drivers. If you reduce the greenhouse gas emissions rapidly from the atmosphere in the next 20 years, you might feel less impact on sea level rise. You might feel um, uh, less desertification. So there's climate change mitigation. Second one is the triggers. How to deal with the triggers? We have disaster risk reduction. We have climate change adaptation and development. Then we have impacts where we try to deal with crisis response, or we try to find durable solutions. So this is the whole idea of climate change and migration here. On the right hand side in the picture, you can see I think it's a picture from cyclone. I think it's in Haiti or somewhere, I forget. These 8 families are still living in the cave because of flood, and because they're not going to relocate to other place. They don't have a house to go. Now, closing this section only, what did we learn from the whole thing here? That environmental change will affect migration now and in the future, specifically through its influences on the range of economic, social, political drivers, which themselves affect migration, which basically means what I argued earlier, that climate change or environment is not the sole reason of migration. There will be always different reasons that will make people to migrate or make people to take a decision for migration. Apart from that, powerful economic, political, and social drivers mean that migration is likely to continue regardless of environmental change. So even if you keep environmental change outside, migration is still going to happen because of other reasons. The third point here is the complex interactions of drivers can lead to different outcomes, which include migration, displacement, plant relocation. So basically means it will be rarely be impossible to distinguish. It will be rarely possible to distinguish individuals for whom environmental factors are the sole driver, as we just discussed in the last 15 minutes, that it's not the only driver. And sometimes migration can represent a transformational adaptation or environmental change, and in many cases will be an extremely effective way to build long-term resilience. So the fourth point is a little bit important here, because let me reflect on the fourth point, because we talked that migration can represent transformational adaptation to environmental change. So I'm not sure how many of you are aware that there is this new debate on transformational adaptation to climate change, which means basically you have to transform the whole system. For example, let's say that there is a drought-prone area in India. Let's say, for example, in Western Odisha, every year people face drought, and desertification is happening over the years, and people are no longer able to cultivate the same land they used to cultivate 20 years before because of desertification. So if this kind of things accumulate in the next 2 decades, that means, let's say, around 4,000 square kilometers of land area is no longer cultivable. So people have to stop cultivation there. They stop cultivation from agriculture, they will shift to somewhere else, and the whole land is gone. So that's a kind of example of transformational adaptation, where the whole system change. We are no longer able to do the things you used to be able to do earlier. And in some cases, migration can represent a transformational adaptation. We can say that migration is a kind of transformational adaptation. People are no longer able to live in the places they migrated, and the whole system changed there. The whole economy changed. So these are the four four major points that came out of the last discussion that we had. Now coming to the now I'll come to a bit different aspect of the debate. We discussed quite a lot about the reasons and why it's happening and how climate change can really lead to climate migration. But let's come to the topic of policy response. What can we do now on the whole thing? So we have this whole broad spectrum of things we have, like first of all, you reduce the influence of global environmental change, reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, and bring it down the impact of climate change. So no longer you have to face the environmental change, or you don't have to face disasters as frequently as we are doing now. Or you plan or respond to migration in the context of climate change or global environmental change. Let's say, for example, you plan for really good urban growth for the people. You know that millions of people of India, for example, migrating to the cities every year because of natural disasters as an important factor. So you make planning for them. How do you make a urban place climate migrant friendly? You can have that plan in place, which of course we don't have in India right now. That we don't want urban places to be migration friendly, because we don't treat climate migrant or general migration in terms of a positive response. We see them as an influx of people coming to the city, but you can have a policy response where you make the urban places climate migrant friendly. That's the second kind of response you can have. And thirdly, you can recognize that migration is an adaptation option. Okay, everything else there, we know that we can't really control climate change anymore. At least we are now attached to the impact for the next 2 decades. So let's accept that migration is a form of adaptation, and let's try to do something about it. Let's facilitate migration. Let's build new cities. Let's relocate communities from the risk areas. So these are the different kind of uh, policy responses you can have in the context of climate change and migration. Now, coming to the another slide here, you can have like you can think about in 3 ways type of action. You can see in terms of level of action. You can think in terms of types of human mobility. Types of action. You can have cooperation. You can have coordination. You can have enhanced understanding, which is in the right hand side of this slide. In terms of level of actions, you can take national action, you can take regional action, you can take international action. For example, at international level, especially the United Nations has not recognized yet someone called climate refugee. Climate refugee is a vague word. There is no international basis. If someone migrate from one place to other because of climate change, let's say one guy migrate from Bangladesh to India, and he's living just near the border. He's living in the Char Island, and because of the flood, he migrated from Bangladesh to India, and he will ask India that, okay, I migrated because of severe flood in my area, and our border is very porous. I just come to here and give me asylum because of climate change. But there is no law for that. Internationally, climate refugees are not recognized. Government of India can't really give them asylum because of the environmental reasons, which is happening in other parts of the world. That's a different topic, like how through legal means we can really establish the rights of migrants who are going because of climate change. So that's the second one. You can have action at the national level or at the local level. Then also it's the type of mobility, whether it's displacement, whether it's migration, or whether it's plant relocation. They are the three. On the left hand side, you can see there is different kind of options, like structural options, non-structural options. You can have insurance, you can have social protection. Sorry. Now, coming to the let's say my favorite part of the topic, where I have been working since few years now. In the last slide, I talked about plant relocation. I don't know how many of you know really about plant relocation, sorry, because of climate change. You need to shift people from their homes to other place, and that can be done in 3 ways. Like you can have a preemptive plant displacement, where you can plan beforehand that in this place people are going to be affected because of climate change, and let's plan to move these people out of the area to somewhere else. That's called preemptive plant displacement. Then you have forced displacement, voluntary or unplanned. For example, there is a flood coming every year to a community near the coast, and they just displace that forced displacement. Then you have preemptive plant relocation. You can make, let's say, all the people from Sundarban shift from Sundarban to somewhere else because of flooding. So you can put the plan in beforehand to shift the people. On the left hand side, you can see in the concept of managed retreat. Again, I am not sure how many of you are really familiar with the concept of managed retreat, which is, in other words, kind of plant relocation of people because of impact of climate change. And what you do here is you find out the area where you think, or the government think, that people are really at the risk of displacement. And the next 1 decade or so, they have to leave the place because it will be no longer viable for them to live in that place, or at least in the risky area. So then we talk about managed retreat. We retreat from the risky areas in a managed way. You took the people out of the place to different place, to a safe place, through a managed planning. I will come to an example later, but this is the kind of options we have in terms of policy. I talked about the policy options here. The, you can see in the third one, we can recognize an adaptation, and we start planning for that. So this is an example of planning for climate change and migration. We do managed retreat. We take the people out of the risky areas and we put them somewhere else. That we call managed retreat. Now, these are the few examples around the world where I try to show you how actually they have dealt with slow onset and rapid onset disaster, and what kind of displacement happened. For example, let's say in Alaska in US, 500 people were displaced because of floods and storm. It was forced. It was not planned. In the case of, if you look at the case of, let's say, the case of Washington, the third case in the US, 660 people were, sorry, I think I am missing something here. Yeah, okay, slow onset, rapid onset. Okay, so sorry, I have some problem here. I don't know what I'm missing. I think I mistyped a column here because you can see the countries are different from here. So let's forget about this. So now let's focus on the 1, 2, 3, fourth column onwards, where you can see how many people has been displaced because of disasters in China, Philippines, Bangladesh, and India. So I think, yeah, now I got it. This is the data from International Displacement Monitoring Center, where you can see how many people has been displaced because of rapid onset disasters in China, Philippines, Bangladesh, and India in the last 10 years or something. I'm sorry, I don't remember it right now, but you can see the number of people being displaced every year because of climate change. And the most important part is the last column in the slide, which is funding. You all know that at the global level, the COP26 is coming now in the next 2 months, and all the developing countries or the low-income countries are really trying hard to get $100 billion every year from, as promised by the developed country in the earlier COPs, but that's not happening. So global adaptation of finance is at the heart of the debate of climate change. The low-income countries, they don't have funds. Where do they get the fund to locate people? Where do they get the fund to deal with migration? So funding has been also really issue in the case of migration as well. That was the point. Now, these are the lessons that has been learned predominantly in the case of plant relocation. The first one is, as I told, funding is predominantly provided by federal or national level sources. Let's say, for example, in India, we don't have any national level fund for climate change migration. There is the state government can really just go to the state government and say, okay, we need fund for migration. The state government the central government will say, no, we don't have any kind of fund for that. And for globally, for the most of the low and middle income countries, international aid and development assistance has been the major source of relocation funding. So they don't have any own sources of funding to deal with the migration or to relocate people from risky areas. So what is the need of the hour is more funding for them. They need more money to do that. So, and the national level funding and international grants have been the dominant forms of assistance for plant relocation, which is kind of a different aspect, but I don't want to go to that one. But for now, what I try to focus here from this point is that funding for well-managed and strategically planned preemptive relocation is missing. Even if we talk about climate change and migration, we don't have really fund in the low-income countries, not only in India, but all the low-income countries, let's say in the Pacific Islands, they don't have really well-designed fund to make plant relocation. That's the whole idea here. Now, coming to the last section. I'm sorry, you all are okay. It's a long. Please knock my door if I'm going fast or something. So this is the last part of the lecture, and I try to close after a few slides here. So this slides show that how many people in India are really at risk of displacement. You can see from the left hand side the projected average mean temperature for India in the RCP 8.8, RCP 8.5, which is business as usual. On the right hand side, you can see on the top, you can see how many people are expected to be displaced per year because of sudden onset disasters. You can see that 81,720 people because of earthquake, some 36,000 because of storm surge, some 3,000, 4,000 because of tsunami, some 240,000 because of cyclonic wind. So these are the kind of data statistics for India. On the on the right hand side corner, you can see one data from International Disaster Monitoring Center, where they've tried to show from July 17 to 2020 how many people have been displaced because of weather events in India. So what I'm trying to say here is India is not something outside of the purview. India is also at the risk of displacement, which is already happening, but the debate is not yet really prolific at the national level. But it's still India is at the risk of climate change and migration. Now, in the case of India, what are the options we have in terms of when we talk about migration? So, a natural disaster due to floods, cyclones has been a recurrent phenomenon. Every year we're listening to news that in Uttarakhand, this much of people are displaced. In Bihar, every year, millions of people are being displaced because of floods. It's happening every year. You read the news every year and you just get silent. The next year again, the news can come. 1 million people in Bihar displaced because of floods. In terms of India, what are the things we have? We have on the one hand, we have Disaster Management Act 2005, Coastal Regulation June Notification 2019 for the coastal belt of India, National Rehabilitation and Settlement Policy 2007, Right to Fair Compensation and Transparency in Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Settlement Act 2013. These three are really the 3 or 4 national acts that are existing in India to deal with climate migration in some way. We don't have a separate policy for migration, but these policies somehow bring together the different elements of climate migration and to deal with it. So what I'm emphasizing here is that basically we don't have a legal structure in India yet to discuss about climate change and migration. We are just still dealing with migration in a sporadic way through different acts of disaster management, through coastal zone regulation, to Right to Fair Compensation Act, etc. At the national state level, we have the State Action Plan on Climate Change, but go and look at the State Action Plan on Climate Change, even the National Action Plan on Climate Change, you hardly find anything on migration. It's not a debate yet. I'm not sure if this year they have updated the document and they're talking about climate migration, but there is no mention of climate migration there. So what we are lacking here in terms of climate migration in India is that we don't have legal things in place. We don't have policy in place to talk about it, to deal with it. What we are doing here is only we're listening everything from the media. We don't have any legal structure to deal with governing climate migration in India. Now, this is an interesting slide. I don't know if you guys can see it, but there are a few cases I have tried to note it down. This is my upcoming paper to be published, and I have tried to note down some of the places where you can see in Odisha, West Bengal, Maharashtra, and Karnataka, and Gujarat, and Andhra Pradesh how the whole migration thing is happening. Where are the places that people are being relocated? What's happening because of floods? And you can see that on the last column, current funding mechanism, almost what we have is post-disaster emergency funding. We don't have any preemptive funding. Either we have state level funding or we have post-disaster funding. We don't have any kind of really preemptive funding, which means you can access fund before the disaster happens for the migrant. Let's say take the example of Bihar. Every year in Bihar, people are being displaced because of floods. And suppose the government will put a funding mechanism in place where the state government can get the funds before the monsoon season. And once the flood happens, they will use it for the relocation of people because of floods. So that's kind of preemptive funding. But what we have now is post-disaster and emergency funding. We don't have any preemptive funding. Once the disaster strikes, we go to the state government, okay, give us funding. We go to the central government, give us funding, and we then deal with the disaster, which is already late. So this should change. We should go from post-disaster funding to pre-disaster financing. We should have a concrete mechanism at the national level to deal with migration as a pre-disaster funding, especially in the case of rapid onset disaster for, let's say, for floods and cyclones and other kind of things. So this is just an example that India is not really out of the migration thing, although we don't have much literature on that, but still we can see the cases here that people are migrating because of climate change from different parts of India, which is still a salient debate, and still you only see in the newspaper kind of thing. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you can see in all those states the trend is starting now. The migration is happening because of climate change. So this is a kind of example that I'm giving. Now, yeah, as I told earlier, that I will come to the case of Odisha, where I told about the case of Satavaya. It's a state it's a place in eastern Odisha, where in 2006, 2007, 600 families were relocated from the place called Satavaya through the State Government Act, Disaster Management Act, and they use the local level funding for plant relocation. So this is one of the cases of plant relocation, how you really move the people in a planned way. I wanted to show you this because this is one of the first case, maybe I think in India, after the Ghoramara Island in the Sundarbans, that we have seen people being relocated through state government actions, which is really rare in India. So these kind of things really need to pick up in the future. You really need to be proactive when you talk about climate change and migration. You need to shift people from one place to other in a proactive way, in a managed way, rather than dealing it as a disaster, as a post-disaster thing. So this is one example. Lastly, what are the key issues of the debate in the case of India here? As we discussed earlier, there has been a lack of coordinated policy at the central level to address displacement from slow and rapid onset disaster both. I gave the example of Bihar. You don't have any mechanism in place for Bihar floods every year to deal with the migration happening there. No, you don't have. For the slow onset disaster like sea level rise, you don't have a policy at the national level to deal with it. You don't have. Second, most responsibility of plant relocation or managing migration lies in the hand of local government, which again means that we don't have a policy at the state level or at the national level to deal with climate change and migration. And third, there are significant existing political and legal challenges such as community buy-in, lack of political mechanisms to address plant relocation, and complex land rights and housing issues. In the urban areas, you have housing issues to relocate. In the rural areas, you have land rights to relocate people because of climate change and migration. So these are the few issues that have in the case of India here. Now, in the last two slides, I would like to close with what kind of principles that we have when we talk about designing funding principles of climate change and migration. So the first one is we should minimize the long-term societal cost. When we talk about climate change and migration, you try to avoid multiple retreats. I don't want to go into the details of this because this gets complicated here in the debate. But I want to show you that there has to have some principles which should act as a basis for any funding for climate change and migration. For example, like you have to minimize the long-term societal cost. You have to look at the distributional equity, who is getting what. You have to minimize the social disruption when you talk about migration, and you have to be transparent and accountable when you talk about any policy measures in the context of climate change and migration. So we have the four basic principles for designing funding principles for climate change and migration. And I think that I will end here. And thank you very much for the patience listening. I think I kept my time just 2 minutes ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for a very informative and interesting session with us. I think you laid down sort of a very strong base with past and present studies on migration and linking it to climate change implications. So, discussing the multi-causality, especially of climate-induced migration, is a very important aspect, and very often very less discussed aspect also, because for many authors and for many researchers, there is always a strong liking to give a strong cause and link, cause and effect between different issues and any studies. So, accepting that there is a multi-causality in migration, and as a matter of fact, any other ecological studies. So that gives us a very, and discussing it with several examples and case studies, give a very strong base of what we are looking at when we are talking about migration, and which is induced by climate change. So, thank you very much for sharing your time and your experience and research with us. If you have any questions, we can put it in the chat box here, or also we can, participants can switch on their microphone and ask those questions. So, meanwhile, no others can frame their questions and maybe put it in the chat box. I just wanted to have a simple understanding with from you, sir. My area of interest is ecology basically, and I work with sometimes agricultural ecosystems as well. So. In India, we very often say that India is an agricultural-based economy, and people from villages, basically the rural-urban migration, which is a very well-known pattern of migration in our country. How strong that pattern of migration is, and is there any ways apart from changing climate and changing rainfall pattern that we can link this urban-rural migration to climate change, and maybe say that it is induced by climate change, and not only in the seeking better opportunities for employment and health facilities and education that this is happening.
Yeah, yeah. As I told earlier, this is the case here because we have really less kind of methodological development, at least in terms of climate change and this whole debate of climate-induced migration. I agree to the point. I agree to your point that it's already happening. People are migrating because of drought, and people are migrating because of less agricultural production. Because it's really need. I think it's really need more research from the field to really establish the fact that environment is kind of dominant factor in terms of migration. That's why we're talking about qualitative research more nowadays in the field of climate change migration. We ask the people. You take a mixed method approach in terms of both qualitative research and quantitative research. Well, it's not always possible to do the numbers and establish the fact that they are migrating because of climate change. So you go to the field and ask the people, live their experience, and do some qualitative mixed studies to find the fact that they are migrating because of climate change. So one solution in this case, in terms of methodology, is to really have a qualitative way of study and study the perception of people in terms of migration, which is a dominant factor nowadays as well. People are really interested to study people's perception on the fact on climate change and migration. So yeah, these are the kind of aspects that you can think when we are talking about rural urban migration. But I feel that it's happening already. But that's why I told about slow onset and rapid onset disasters. In the case of rapid onset disasters like floods and cyclone, it's very easy to establish the fact that flood happened and people migrated. But in the case of like droughts, which is like recurring phenomena, very slow, it's really hard to establish that they are migrating only because of droughts and floods. So yeah, I think you have to be a little bit careful here when interpreting this thing.
Just a follow up to your answer, sir. So there would be a lot of subjectivity that we can expect from understanding the perception of people who are migrating from one place to another. It could be, sometimes they, so how if you design a study like this, if anyone wishes to do a study like this, how to deal with those subjectivity in terms of perception that we are going to get in terms of response from people?
Yeah, well, there are many ways to do it, but one thing there is a like it's kind of depends on how do you really design the whole survey, because nowadays even if you do a qualitative study, there are many ways to really do it rightly and correctly. And I think once you follow the real guidelines and protocols at the international level, there are a few international level guidelines on how to do a qualitative study. Like, let's say, for example, we have this international protocol for doing randomized control trials. There is international protocols. You have to apply for your case at the international portal on randomized control trials. Then they will give you permission to do the randomized control trial. They will analyze your, whether it is robust or not. So in the case of qualitative studies also, there are many ways that you have to, follow the protocols and do it right. So what happens in most of the qualitative cases, at least In India, many of the students, they just go to the field and ask few questions and they tell, okay, this is a qualitative study, which is not the case. There is also rigorousness in the qualitative studies, and you need to follow the real guidelines to do that. So I think it's still possible till the time you follow the real the good practices of qualitative study designs.
That's a very good advice on study designs. Thank you. So, if there are other participants who wish to ask their questions, please put it in the chat box, or to save time, you can also switch on your microphone and ask.
Hello, good afternoon, sir.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask that as we know in India, because of extreme, we are having more and more flood events like and heat waves and droughts, and due to more, these extreme events, we might always also see more migration to the Indian cities, right?
Yeah.
So I wanted to know, sir, what do you think? When more and more, because our city already overpopulated because of job opportunities and all. A lot of people from the small towns also migrate to those. So what problems our cities are going to face, or are our cities actually ready to cope up such high influx of population?
Yeah.
Just what are your views, and what how can it be treated? How these policies and the problems that are going to be raised by this climate migration can be handled
Yeah.
positively?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's really interesting question, and I will start from the one example from Bangladesh. We all know that Bangladesh has been a real champion now at the global level in terms of climate change adaptation. And in the recent Mujib Prosperity Plan they're bringing out, what they're talking about is, as I told, I think somewhere in the discussion, that you need to design climate-friendly urban cities. And one aspect of it is that you invite the migrants from the rural areas, or at least make the cities livable for the poor people if they are migrating because of climate change or because of any other reason. So this is the kind of policy approach that we need to have in India as well, at least in terms of recognizing the fact that people are going to migrate more and more to the urban cities. That's a good question about the carrying capacity of urban areas. How much population can they really carry in terms of population, in terms of water, in terms of electricity? That's a different question altogether, which is kind of question on the optimality of the urban areas. For that also, we have a lot of research going on how to make urban places more livable, like let's say how to reduce the emissions and how to make it more ecosystem based, and this kind of adaptation actions. But the question was right, that okay, you can't really stop the environmental migration from rural areas in India. That is going to be happen. You can't really stop that because people will migrate. That's what we know from the history. But the point here is what kind of policies you need to put both at the origin level and the destination level to manage, to keep the balance. Everyone from the rural places are not migrating voluntarily. Few people are migrating because of forcefully, because they don't have any source of income anymore. It's only we see that people are migrating a lot from rural areas, but we don't really distinguish who are migrating voluntarily and who are migrating non-voluntarily. So if you can keep the non-voluntary people at the origin and let the voluntary people go to the destination and make different arrangements for them in the cities, sustainable arrangements, then you can really have some impact in terms of managing migration both at the origin and the destination. I think that's how we can approach, at least in terms of policy.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Anyone else wants to ask any question? Please go ahead. Any of the participants? In India, one more thing I want to ask. In India, what do you think? As you have already well presented in your presentations, everything a lot. So, according to the recent sixth assessment report of the IPCC, they said that India is going to experience more and more heat waves. I think
Right.
heat waves specifically, in India, up till now we see like floods and droughts are the major, or sea level rise I've also read about the islands, like the villages which live in the Sundarbans area are continuously getting eroded by the waves, and that is also posing a great threat to the land loss and the rehabilitation and resettlement of the people or populations which are living there. So I just wanted to ask you, so what do you think, after sea level rise, as we say, and this drought, what is going to be the biggest problem? Because these days we are also seeing more and more forest fires that are erupting in India, like in Uttarakhand. From
Right.
last, it was such an extended because of more and more dry season. The forest fires are also becoming more frequent. So, what do you think, sir? Except for floods, what is going to be the biggest challenge for India in the coming years due to climate change?
Yeah, that's again a good question. But also, I think if you look at the recent IPCC, the physical science basis report, and the way they have put it, that it's a red code for the humanity, which basically means that you are not really out of danger of any kind of disasters now. As you just mentioned, that heat waves and wildfires, that was nowhere in the last 5 or 6 decades. Let's say, for example, take the example of Bangalore. In the 1960s, nobody was using any air conditioner in Bangalore. But if you go now to Bangalore, they're all using the air conditioner. So this research on heat islands, we call it heat island. All the urban places are becoming heat island, and you are right that heat waves and wildfires are going to the major reason for climate change impact, like having major climate impact. But in terms of I think displacement, I will still think that flooding and sea level rise are going to be the major area of concern for India, because you see the examples of Bihar. Every year it gets flooded and people get displaced, but we don't do anything. We just wait for the next monsoon to come and let people migrate again. So the whole point of this red code for humanity and the whole point of this AR6 physical science basis is that we are not really out of danger from any disasters now in the next 2 or 3 decades. If you're not going to do anything, we are going to feel with the same intensity all the disasters like floods, cyclones, tropical cyclones, and there is now also enough evidence in the AR6 at least in terms of what we call the debate of attribution to climate science. So there is enough evidence now to prove that mm, um, all the extreme events are happening because of anthropogenic climate change or because of greenhouse gas emissions. So this is really red warning with the AR6 report. We are not really out of danger from any of the disasters. So better India start planning for adaptation now.
Yeah, sure. Yes, sir. Definitely.
So, if there are any more questions from for sir, let's
Yeah.
Himanshu, you can go ahead, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sir, I want to ask what can be done at the policy level to deal with to deal with the issue of migration due to disasters, and also, do you think the only the disaster management authority is not enough? We need a environmental task force having the intellectuals and the other collaborative team also. Like the it is high time we are in the height of this climate crisis and all.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And yes, that's true that we need to really start acting fast now in the climate change. And to your point on task force, yes, of course, we need more task force in migration. Migration. I am not saying about other areas, but for the migration, I am sure that's valid suggestion that India should have task force at the national level and state level to really look at the issue what's happening. But before that, I think there is still lack of research in the field of climate change and migration in India. And through this, I also like to encourage people here who are working and interested in climate change and migration to really take it as area of research, which is really scope for the future. So yes, task force can be something, and in terms of the other aspect of what we can do, we all can do that. But I think migration has a public question here, because all the funding has to come from state or central government. So you can do a task force, but that won't help much in terms of policy or something. What I suggest here is that we need to have a separate policy now on climate change, at least at the national level. As I told, there are 4 kinds of policies which at the national level which deals with different aspects of climate change and migration. There is no single law which deals with every aspect of climate change and migration. So it's the high time that we should start with the legal basis of climate change and migration to deal with climate change and migration. And before that also, we need to recognize that climate change is a problem. Climate change and migration is a problem, which I told that earlier mentioned that you go and see the national adaptation plan or the state adaptation plan, you won't find a single line on climate change and migration, which basically is reflecting the stand of the government that they are not yet ready to recognize that climate change and migration is an issue. So the first thing is to recognize that, bring that in the national adaptation plan, then start making laws, and then start making policies. I think that's the way to go.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, we will conclude today's session here on behalf of the entire IP College community and all the participants of this course. I once again extend our thanks to you, so for talking to us in this session and giving us some really strong information and research-based ideas about climate change and migration. Thank you very much for joining with us today.
Thanks a lot for the opportunity. Thank you. Thanks for the
you.
interesting questions. Bye-bye.
So thank you, participants. So we will meet on 6th now with the next session by Dr. Anindita Roy Saha. Thank you.